It's great to welcome back to the program Professor Gad Saad, who is a professor of marketing at Concordia University, also author of The Consuming Instinct and the Evolutionary Bases of Consumption. You know, we've spoken about trigger warnings, we've spoken about safe spaces and college campus political correctness. Today, we're going to at least start with the topic of microaggressions. And to have at least a starting point, microaggressions are the verbal, nonverbal, and other slights, snubs, or insults that are intentional or unintentional, which can communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to target individuals based on their marginalized group membership. It's even hard to sort of understand what we're talking about, isn't it?
I mean, it's extraordinary. And the word in your definition that I would probably, con converge to is unintentional, right? I mean, imagine how chilling that word is, right? Because it basically says that not only if you were to actively insult someone, it's bad, but if you engage in a microaggression, which is debatable whether that's bad or not, if you do it intentionally or unintentionally, you're guilty. So basically, you better stay home in a fetal position lest you might offend someone.
My thought on it, I've actually read quite a bit about this in preparation to talk to you, but really the reason I wanted to talk to you is because about 3 or 4 weeks ago, I did a lot more reading about it. And my understanding is that the current way in which microaggressions are sort of interpreted and understood by many has become a total perversion of what what we actually saw from Daryl Wing Su, the professor of psychology at Columbia University, who actually said, you know, these microaggressions, it's not about shaming or punishing people, and it's not at all about establishing control of speech. It's really about understanding the ways in which our speech could be differently understood, but we're not trying to issue a critique or punishment. And even Professor Su believes that there's been a total perversion of the original intention of this word. I don't know how familiar you are with that.
Yeah, so I'm aware of exactly what you said, although I'm not familiar with his original research, but I am indeed aware, as you said, that he considers it to be a perversion. I mean, ultimately, these sort of members of the victimology culture will find any tools available to them to expand the circle of victimhood. And so to the extent that their interpretation of microaggressions serves that purpose, well, then we'll use it.
Can we talk about the way in which there's this sort of bigger picture that you and I have spoken about that includes policing of language, free speech, if it's the right ideas being sort of put out there by that speech, safe spaces, trigger warnings? How would you sort of, how can we put all of these ideas together into an analysis of sort of what is going on in this area of culture?
Well, I think the bottom line is you try to find any way possible to stifle positions, opinions, beliefs, attitudes, thoughts that are contrary to yours. Now, if you're from the Middle East, well, one of the ways that I can shut you down is I behead you. In the West, we don't have that level of barbarism yet, and hopefully ever, but we can find other, more creative, more westernized ways to shut you down. And we'll do that by coming up with new tools to make it, threatening for people to air out their positions. And hence safe spaces, microaggressions, trigger warnings, and all the rest of the stuff that you mentioned are one strategy by which people will think twice before they air out ideas that might be contrary to the herd mentality.
As someone who, I'm speaking about you here, who is very, very critical of the at least the application of how these microaggressions are interpreted, do you see the value, if we were to go back to Professor Su's original intent here, do you see the value in that idea of understanding the way in which comments that to some may seem completely innocuous may be, and in a sense, I don't feel like insulting is even the right word. I feel like microaggressive, if properly interpreted, actually does have some value, which is you don't feel like you've been insulted. You don't feel like the person who you're speaking to is attacking you, but you're sort of cognizant of the lack of awareness that they have about how certain language or certain phrases or statements can make people of certain groups feel a particular way. I find that there is value in that.
So, as I said, I'm not very familiar with his original sort of starting premise,
But
but
big
in
picture.
the manner in which you've described it, it seems reasonable to me. But to take it to another context that's related, the idea of trigger warnings, one could argue, stems from a very noble quest, right?
Hmm.
If I don't like animal cruelty, as is truly the case for me, I mean, that's probably the thing that crushes my soul more than anything. Well, then I would like for someone to warn me that there might be an image in this next video that is problematic. And so we
Right. Yeah. I'm
understand
not
that, right? I
interested
mean,
in seeing that stuff, as I am guessing you're not either.
exactly. And so, in that sense, providing me with a warning makes sense. Then, of course, when you take this starting originally good idea and expand it so that it becomes an all-encompassing, means by which you make people afraid to air out their thoughts, then it becomes problematic. So my suspicion is that the manner in which the professor in question intended it is probably a good idea. The manner that it is subsequently perverted is a bad idea.
I'd like to talk to you now, sort of as a conversation that stems from this with regard to college campuses. And my mom, who's also a college professor, has talked to me extensively about this. She is a tried and true leftist progressive on all issues, et cetera, et cetera. But she has found a very stifling environment in some academic circles with regard to the way in which professors who may disagree on some of these issues are treated, not by other professors who she by and large finds also are finding the imposition of some of these elements relatively oppressive, but more by the apparatus of academia. And this could be individual administrations, these could be so-called national academic groups and organizations, etc. Can you speak to that a bit?
Oh, absolutely. So let's take, for example, students. There's a article that was written by a professor. I can't remember the exact reference, but I'm sure we could find it, where he basically wrote that he is terrified of his liberal students, even though he is a self-admitted liberal himself,
Hmm.
precisely because he's afraid that he's going to walk into class, utter a syllable that somebody will misinterpret or be offended by. And so, therefore, he is literally terrified. I'll give you another example from an administrator. I think this was from Seattle University. Someone had asked a dean, I might get some of the details wrong. Someone had asked the dean about some reading list, and she suggested that the student in question read a book by a African American political activist
Hmm.
who had written a book. The title was, I think, the N word, right? We can't even say it now what it is.
Hmm.
And so, simply by her uttering that word, which was the description of the title of the book, I think she is now on leave. So it has taken, I don't think Orwell could have imagined that we could be at this state. Now, again, this doesn't mean that this is happening every day on every campus, but the
No.
fact that there is this atmosphere is problematic, and we need to fix it.
Can you flesh out some of the stories? We're friends on Facebook, and sometimes you will post to
Sure.
Facebook incidents, conversations that sometimes happen in Montreal, which is where you're located. And some of those I wouldn't really classify as microaggressions. I would really classify them as aggressions. I think there's a lot less sort of ambiguity as to the term there. But are there any particular stories that you could share for our audience who maybe doesn't follow you on Facebook that could help to sort of add color or flesh out the conversation we're having about the way that incidents can play out in society and sort of the impact they have on you based on your identity?
But actual, truly genuine aggressions, or what I consider fake microaggressions? Which ones are you looking for?
I would be open to either. I mean, I know that you just have had the full range of experiences in living in where
Right.
you in Montreal.
Well, I could tell you that, for example, demographically, as the demographic realities in Montreal are changing, it is becoming quite fertile for the environment to be open to, you know, uh, unobstructed Jew hatred. And so I've had several Jewish students at my university, both in person and via email, write to me saying that they genuinely feel afraid in the university. Now, afraid not in the sense that they're going to be taken and beheaded, but that, for example, they don't feel comfortable exhibiting any signs of belongingness to their Jewish identity,
Hmm.
or if they are part of student union, they don't voice, say, a pro-Israel position because the student union is dominated by another group that's hostile to Jews. And so in terms of actual true open aggressions, we are certainly seeing a change in the landscape in Montreal if when it comes certainly to open Jew hatred.
Has your identity, or let me start a different way. Your identity is quite interesting because on the one hand, you are Jewish, but your native tongue is Arabic. Your family went to Canada from Lebanon, as you've spoken to us before. I am a big critic of identity politics where you're only allowed to comment on certain issues based on which boxes you check in terms of your identity, etc. But because you have a sort of less, I don't want to say less common, but more implicitly contradictory to some identity. How has that impacted people's perception of you?
Right. So I think the fact that I do have, that I have that heritage, in a sense, grants me greater leeway
Hmm.
to speak about certain issues that otherwise maybe you may not be able to get away with, which of course is regrettable
Yeah.
because the only way that we should judge anything that you and I say is in terms of their veracity. Is it true? Is it false? Is it accurate? Is it inaccurate? And yet, by virtue of my having had the personal experiences growing up in Lebanon, escaping the execution in Lebanon, being Lebanese Jewish, somehow that gives me the street credentials that allow me to say what I say. Not unlike how a African American is allowed to say the N word, but you're not. And so, in that sense, I'm allowed to say, for example, criticize issues dealing with Islam, if only because I come from that culture. But for you, well, then you would be a Nazi xenophobe.
I think that, and we're sort of getting away from microaggressions here, but I think this is an interesting direction. One of the most startling or concerning elements of the identity politics of who's allowed to comment on what issues or at least be taken seriously, depending on their identity, is those who sort of enforce that idea often miss that the absence of an identity can be just as much of a biasing influence as being part of that identity, in the sense that, for example, when it comes to LGBT rights, many times we hear from the sort of religious right, homophobic religious right, listen, we can't just do what it is that the people that are in the LGBT community want because their views are clearly biased on this issue. And it seems to be completely over their head that not being part of that community could be an equally biasing factor. And this could apply to sort of any circumstance. That's really concerning to me that this sort of identity bias only seems to go one way.
True. Now, I don't know if what I'm going to say next addresses exactly the point that you're making, but in speaking about the lack of identity, this reminds me of a microaggression. When someone says, say, Stephen Colbert says something like, jokingly, right, in his satire, he says, I don't see color, right? I don't see race. I don't even know if I'm white or black. And when he's pointing to a guest, he says, I don't know if you're black or white, right? Well, it turns out that, right, the negation of that identity becomes a form of microaggression, right? So if I want to demonstrate to people that I don't care about your race, right? I mean, if I wanted to abide by Dr. Martin Luther King's famous edict, that itself would be a microaggression. So it really is the case that the snake is now turning around and starting to cannibalize itself on its own tail.
Yeah, I've been criticized pretty significantly, up to and including being called a white supremacist, when I said, I'm not really sure if I am white, sort of in the traditional sense. I know that in American culture, there's no question that because even though I learned English as a second language as an immigrant from South America, early enough to not have an accent, right? I sort of look like just a white American person. I don't know if I am. In one sense, Jews were very often not considered white in the same way that Irish and Italians in the U.S. for some period were not considered white. Now they are. We know the sort of arbitrary nature of that. But also as someone who from no doubt comes from Hispanic culture, if not, I'm not a non-white Hispanic by that definition, even wanting to explore this has actually led to very significant criticism that I find to be completely worthless in terms of its productive value.
Well, you need to get darker skin. It protects me from all sorts of diatribe.
Yeah.
I jokingly, but very effectively, use these types of tactics, again, these sort of social justice warrior tactics against people. So, for example, at one point, I had a heated Twitter exchange with some, I think she was a Forbes reporter. And then once I saw that she was about to start arguing that I was cyberbullying her because I was disagreeing with her, I played all my cards. I said, you better be careful. I'm a dark, I'm a brown person from Lebanon. I'm Jewish. I'm overweight. So I will accuse you of fatism, of Araphobia, of anti-Semitism,
Yeah.
of being against. And then guess what? She disappeared because I used her tricks. I
Hmm.
used her lunacy against her. And I won, regrettably, the argument using the Oppression Olympics scores.
This is an issue that is unlikely to disappear soon, and that's why we've been speaking to Professor Gad Saad about it. Of course, he teaches marketing at Concordia University, and he's joined us a number of times before. Always a pleasure speaking to you.
Thank you so much, sir.